Hello everyone, this is Peter from Birds of Play, and welcome to 5 Things to Fix, a series where we propose 5 fixes for games. It's basically there in the title, so you shouldn't act too surprised. In this video, we will be looking at the first direct sequel in the Final Fantasy franchise, the strangely absurd, yet at times surprisingly adequate, Final Fantasy X-2. Final Fantasy X-2 is considered by many to be an unnecessary sequel to a great game. Its basic premise, that of High Summoner Yuna moving on to other things with her gal pals, returning character Riku, and newcomer Pain, perceived by many to undermine the legacy of the original. Be that as it may, Final Fantasy X-2 nevertheless builds on the legacy of the former in many aspects, addressing some of the faults of its predecessor. You can check out our 5 fixes for Final Fantasy X video if you haven't already, and would like to know more about some of these faults. But for now, let's take Final Fantasy X-2 up on its offer, and revisit the world of Spira, warts and all. Fix number 1. Recycled material. It is to be expected that revisiting the world of Spira would include a lot of familiar locales and characters, giving players the chance to see what unfolded in the aftermath of the first game. With Yuna and her guardians bringing an end to the tyranny of sin and finally ushering in the eternal calm. From a developer's perspective, this approach must have been comparatively cost-effective, allowing for various assets to be reused, as opposed to develop from scratch. In regard to some aspects, however, the developers seemingly went the extra mile with Final Fantasy X-2. For example, instead of rehashing the battle system from the first game, they opted for an innovative new system with a vast array of classes to choose from. In regard to characters and locales, Final Fantasy X-2 also sports some fresh faces and places. Counts such as Kilika have even gotten a makeover, giving us a glimpse into how it's been successfully rebuilt after having been destroyed by Sin 2 years prior, during the events of Final Fantasy X. These additions are, however, few and far between. One would imagine that reusing such assets would have afforded the developers added legroom to expand on the world, even further than they did. New additions in Final Fantasy X-2 mostly consisting of new dungeons as opposed to lived-in locales, making for rather limited world building. I realize you can't have it all, but if there was one location in the original Final Fantasy X that needed fleshing out, it was the city of Bevel. The player only getting access to some hallways and an underground dungeon that had little to do with the bustling metropolis Bevel was made out to be. In Final Fantasy X-2, Bevel is sadly still closed off to the player, even though you can now pass the gate for a few more hallways and a lot more dungeon. Letting the player explore Bevel further would have helped justify the rather extensive amount of reused assets in Final Fantasy X-2, thereby making the world feel larger and more Bevelable. Fix number 2. Unanswered Questions. As the first direct sequel in the Final Fantasy series, Final Fantasy X-2 is a game that looks to the future unapologetically, imagining the future of Spira with the same enthusiasm and at times absurdity that characterizes the minds of many fan fiction writers. As the people of Spira try their best to gain their bearings in a peaceful world, finally able to allow themselves to plan for the future, Yuna treads her own path, saying goodbye to her reserved self and welcoming a more self-assured Yuna, one that is willing to steal from others, given the proper incentive, and to sing in front of a live audience in the rain. As Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz would have it, we are not in Kansas anymore. Having stepped outside what we have learned to perceive as normal, and entered an unfamiliar and at times strange new world, Yuna herself often having trouble navigating these turbulent waters. However, seeing as Yuna and her gal pals are self-designated sphere hunters, a profession originally concerned with uncovering Spira's past, it might have been prudent of them to also shed some light on the not-too-distant past, maybe even clearing up some unanswered questions from the first game. Perhaps some questions are better off not answered, maintaining an air of mystery, or even carefully constructed ambiguity. At least those that take issue with the introduction of midichlorians into the Star Wars universe might be inclined to agree that it isn't necessary to explain the metaphysics behind Tidus' existence in the world of Spira. Instead, the developers could have delved deep into the mysteries of Ba's temple, for example, explaining how Seymour's mother's faith statue got transported to the temple. Perhaps this isn't the most interesting matter to address, but whichever plot hole the developers might have wanted to stomp, they missed a chance to retroactively improve Final Fantasy X, giving some fan service of actual substance by catering to fans of the first game, as opposed to just having the girls take a quick bath in their swimwear. Fix number 3. The death of Blitzball. If you've seen our Learning to Love Blitzball video, or just played Final Fantasy X in general, then you will know that Blitzball as a minigame is by no means without its faults. It's an interesting concept, but the execution was as ambitious as it was flawed, resulting in an experience that quickly overstayed its welcome for most. To make matters worse, players had to endure at least one whole game of Blitzball in order to progress through the game. A match that for most ended up in a humiliating defeat at the hands of the overly smug Luca Goers. Of course, some players pushed past the initial frustration and found something they genuinely liked, or were at least willing to play. Regardless of whichever camp you might fall into in regard to appreciating Blitzball, it would however be hard to overstate its importance to the world of Spira. Due to Blitzball being an all but inseparable part of Spira's culture, the sport made an inevitable comeback in the sequel. However, this time around things were drastically different. In Final Fantasy X-2, players don't control the players like in Final Fantasy X, but rather they take on a more managerial role compared to the previous game, creating formations and adjusting how hard they play. The result is quite underwhelming and does little to satiate the hunger of real Blitzball fans, presenting them with a diluted version of the game they love. For those that disliked Blitzball in Final Fantasy X, the mere fact that it's optional in Final Fantasy X-2 might be a win in and of itself. The fact that playing Blitzball isn't required for 100% completion is just the cherry on top. However, since Blitzball seems to be isolated in its own little sphere in Final Fantasy X-2, not impacting anything else within the game aside from offering some items, the developers might just as well have kept the original version of Blitzball in. Or better yet, taken advantage of player feedback from the first game to make improvements to the game, maybe even saving it from its own inadequacy. Bring Blitzball back, just don't force me to play it. Fix number 4. Completionist. Final Fantasy X-2 is packed with optional content that the player can miss just by rushing through the story. In some sense, Final Fantasy X-2 is a completionist paradise, loaded with things to do, meticulously tracking the player's completion percentage, with the aim of rewarding players with different endings based on their diligence. This includes completing a variety of minigames and seeing all the cutscenes without skipping them. With so much to do, it can be difficult to keep track of it all, especially if you're juggling your progress across multiple playthroughs, making use of Final Fantasy X-2's robust New Game Plus mode. The official strategy guide, tasked with guiding the player to the holy grail of completion, includes a much-needed checklist, although it might be hard for some players to write in their books. Another option is to upload your save game into a third-party save viewer to track your progress. All of this extra hassle, however, could be easily avoided by featuring the checklist in the game itself, fixing the problem by sticking it in Shinra's computer. No, not that Shinra. Fix number 5. The job system. Final Fantasy X-2 marked the return of the job system to the Final Fantasy series, after having been absent since Final Fantasy V, simultaneously paying homage to and building on the history of the franchise. There are 20 jobs in total, or dress spheres as they are referred to in the game, some having been patched in at a later date. The jobs range from traditional classes such as a warrior, thief, and white mage, to more esoteric ones such as gun mage, songstress, and the newly added festivalist. One of the major departures from more traditional iterations of the job system is that players are able to switch jobs mid-battle, and are in fact encouraged to do so. Special dress spheres that function like limit breaks or summons, only being available after having activated every job in a single battle. Collecting dress spheres can be a real joy, as well as unlocking new abilities, not to mention the satisfaction that comes with maxing out a class to 100%. Coming in hot on the tail of Final Fantasy X, however, when almost every character had a particular role to play, many of the classes in Final Fantasy X-2 feel a bit redundant. Instead of needing to play to your strengths and weaknesses, by strategically choosing the right class for the right job, like in Final Fantasy X, it's just as viable to throw 3 attackers of the same class at the target until it stops moving. The problem isn't necessarily with the classes themselves, but rather the enemies. Seeing as they normally don't require any specific approach, giving the classes very little to measure up against. This might be due to Final Fantasy X-2's battle system being much more fast-paced, leaving less room for strategy. The result is, nevertheless, that the drastic system feels a bit more shallow than it actually is. Offering players more resistance and a more nuanced challenge, requiring them to dive deeper into the classes, might however fix this problem, by helping to properly enunciate what sets them apart. Sailor Moon, eat your heart out. Thank you for watching 5 Things to Fix. Join in the conversation and tell us some of your fixes down in the comments below. If you liked the video or like to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We hope to see you next time. Has anyone seen my eggs?